Now that we have the commission employee class, let's create another class, and this class is called the base plus commission employee class. This class will have more or less the same details, but this is the type of employee that gets a base salary along with the commission that is earned on the gross sales. So this most of the details of this employee will be coming from the commission employee. So what we can do is we can copy these data members from here, or maybe most of the details along with the setters and getter methods, because we'll only need to make a few changes in the code of the base plus commission employee. So we can copy these details over here. We will change the name of the constructor, since we are using base plus commission employee now. And rest of the details are the same. The base plus commission employee has an additional data member, and that is called the base salary. The earnings for the base plus commission employee will be calculated by adding the base salary to the commission rate, the commission that is earned on the gross sales. We also need to add a set and get method for the base salary, as well as a validation statement. The salary cannot be, for example, less than 0. So we'll add a simple validation statement by copying now. The constructor might not recognize the base salary as a local variable because we are not passing the base salary as an argument to the constructor. Now it has become a local variable of the constructor. Base salary. So we cannot have a negative value for the base salary. We'll also have a setter and getter method for the base salary. I will just copy these two methods, and I will modify these methods to create methods for the base salary variable. Need to make sure that and the gross sales is replaced by the base salary. Now the variables names with this keyword are the instance variables, as we understand, and the variables that are shown in the black in this IDE are local to the method. Base salary cannot be less than 0. Now that we have added the methods for the base salary, into this class. We also need to add the base salary to the commission that the employee has earned on the gross sales. Now this earnings method returns the earnings for the base plus commission employee, and if we may, we can add that detail over here as well. So we will need to add more format specifiers. This one is for the base salary. Now if we add an object for the base plus commission employee over here, we can copy the constructor, the object declaration for the commission employee class, and making the necessary changes. Now this constructor expects 6 arguments. An additional argument will be for the basics or the base salary of the employee. Now let's print the base plus commission employee object, and let's see what kind of an output do we get. Base salary at the moment is not being assigned. We will need to check what kind of a logical error do we have over here. But if we look at the two statements, there is a minor change. We are just adding to the existing information that we had in the commission employee. We have added only one additional variable, and we have created a completely new class for the base plus commission employee. What we can do over here is use inheritance that will reduce this programming effort for us. We will not need to compile this entire code again and debug this entire code again. We can simply use inheritance that we will reduce this effort for us. Now to use inheritance, what we can do is we will inherit the common details from the commission employee. So the details that the base plus commission employee shares with the commission employee will be removed from the base plus commission employee, and instead we will extend the commission employee into the base plus commission employee. And now these details are redundant over here. So we will remove the redundant details, and we can see that there is an error generated, and the reason for that error is, if you remember, we need to call the superclasses constructor from the subclasses constructor. Previously, the objects class default constructor was being called implicitly, but now we have a super class, that is the commission employee, that has an explicit constructor, and we need to call that constructor to be able to initialize the variables that are being initialized by the commission employee. And we can now safely remove these details that are being initialized in the commission employee. Remember that we do not need to remove, we cannot remove these parameters from the parameter list of the base plus commission employee. We will remove this line now because it is not calling the implicit default constructor. If you remember, what we do is we use the super keyword to pass. Now we can see that the previous error has been removed, and now it is expecting the same number of arguments that are there in the parameter list of the commission employee constructor. So we'll pass all of the variables that are being initialized in the superclass constructor. Commission rate, so these 5 variables are passed to the superclasses constructor, and this will be initialized in the superclass. And now we can safely remove the initializations for these variables from the subclasses constructor. We'll only leave the variable that is specific to the subclass, and that is the base salary variable. All of the variables that belong to the superclass have been removed from the subclasses constructor. We also do not need these setter and getter methods. These are totally redundant. Apart from the getter setter methods for the base salary. But now we can see that we cannot access the private variables of the superclass in the subclass now. So we will remove the setter getter methods for the superclass variables. The problem arises in the earnings method. Previously, we were directly using the gross sales and the commission rate variable to calculate the values or the earnings for the base plus commission employee. Now these two variables belong to the superclass, and we cannot directly access them. What we can do is we can access the getter methods for those variables. So get commission rate and get gross sales will exactly do the same for us. We can also see that the earnings method can now be overridden from the superclass, and we'll come to this later. But now we need to remove these additional details from the base plus commission employee, or we can use the getter methods to access these variables. The direct access to the private variables of the superclass is not possible, but indirectly we can access those variables using the getter methods. We can also use method overriding, where we can modify the methods that we override from the superclasses, adding the details from the subclass, but we will do that later. At the moment we can see that with very few changes and thanks to the inheritance, we have reduced our programming effort considerably by removing all the redundant code, but our program will work exactly the same. The commission employee can be differentiated from the base plus commission employee in the toString method. Now our base plus commission employee class is complete. The details that previously we were using in the base plus commission employee are now being inherited from the commission employee. In the test class, we do not need to change anything. All of the objects will remain the same, and if we now print the same objects, the results will more or less be the same. Just for differentiating between the two, the commission employee and the base plus commission employee, both with their own values are being printed over here. Additional detail that the base plus commission class is adding is the base salary, and all of these details are coming from the superclass, from the commission employee class. We can change these values, of course, for the base plus commission class. Let's say if we want to change the name of the employee to something different than the commission employee, we can do that. Similarly, these details can be changed as well, because these are two different objects with their own values. We maybe want to reduce the commission for the base plus commission employee now, and if we print the details, both of the objects will print their own corresponding details, as we can see. And now if we want to print the earnings for these employees, we can do that by calling the earnings method in the toString method for each class. Let's say if we want to print the earnings for the commission employee, we can add the format specifiers that will hold the value for the earnings of this employee. We expect that this will print the earnings of the commission employee, and similarly we'll make a similar change in the base plus commission employee class, and we expect that we'll get the earnings for the base plus commission employee by calling the earnings method in the toString method. We can also print the earnings of the employee by calling the earnings method using the objects of these classes in the test class. Now if we try to print the objects, we hope that the total earnings for the employee is being printed now by calling the earnings method in the toString method. So for example, if an employee has gross sales of 10,000 with a commission rate of 6%, the earnings of the employee will be 600. And if the employee has a gross sales of 50,000 with a commission rate of 3% and a base salary of 2,000, then the earnings of the employee is 3,500, where 1,500 is coming from the commission and 2,000 is coming from the base salary of the employee.